At 9 a.m., inside a packed congressional chamber, Jasmine Crockett and Lauren Boebert took their seats on opposite sides of a fierce debate over public health policy. What began as a hearing on vaccines and government response quickly spiraled into a national flashpoint as Crockett confronted deadly misinformation head-on, while Boebert pushed back with a so-called leaked email. Then came the turning point: emotional testimony, a shattered lie, and Crockett's voice cutting through the noise with unshakable force. Over 17 million Americans watched live as truth clashed with spectacle, and one woman refused to let silence win. In a country drowning in political theater, what does it take for truth to break through, and who's willing to stand alone to defend it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the Capitol's East hearing room lit up like a war zone. 17 cameras rotated slowly into place, blinking red as the airwaves opened to over 11.2 million live viewers nationwide. The walls, usually bare and bureaucratic, now trembled under the pressure of a hearing no one expected to be calm. This wasn't just about policy, it was about power, trust, and the ghosts left behind by a virus that had already claimed over 1 million American lives. The title on the central screen read, "Public Health Policy in the Age of Crisis, Transparency, Freedom, and Responsibility." Beneath that cold formality sat two women, one calm and composed, the other fire-forged and ready for chaos. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, flanked by binders of CDC data and photographs of victims from underfunded communities, carried the quiet weight of truth. Across from her sat Lauren Boebert, grinning slightly, armed not with facts, but with slogans, and the defiant energy of a woman who had never known the taste of consequence. The silence before the opening gavel was the kind that only comes before a storm. And in that storm, America would be forced to choose truth or theater. The silence that followed felt like a taut wire waiting to snap, and Lauren Boebert, with a gleam in her eye, was the one tightening it. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice sharp as a blade, slicing through the chamber with a chilling certainty. Let's call it what it was. COVID was never a crisis of health. It was a manufactured excuse for government control. Gasps rippled through the back rows. Boebert didn't pause. And these so-called vaccines? Rushed, unproven, experimental. Americans were treated like guinea pigs, all so bureaucrats could feel powerful. Her words weren't just defiance, they were calculated arson, meant to ignite distrust and drown out facts with fury. A few heads nodded behind her, while others stared in disbelief. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't blink. But the camera caught it, the subtle shift in her jaw, the way her lips pressed together so tightly they blanched. It was the restraint of someone who'd buried far too many names to let lies go unchecked. And in that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a dam holding back a flood. The room fractured. On one side, murmurs rose, soft but fervent, like a spark catching dry brush. Words like truth, hero, and freedom floated from a few corners. On the other, stunned silence. Public health experts sat frozen, pens still in midair, lips slightly parted as if trying to process whether they'd really heard what they just heard. A woman in the press box slowly removed her glasses, eyes wide. Boebert smiled, satisfied, like a match proud of the fire it started. But across the table, Jasmine's stillness was volcanic, because what Boebert framed as rebellion, Jasmine knew as betrayal. Betrayal of nurses gasping behind fogged-up face shields. Betrayal of mothers who buried children they couldn't even hold. The unfairness was deafening, not just the distortion of truth, but the ease with which someone like Boebert could dismiss reality and walk away applauded. The question wasn't whether Jasmine would respond. The question was how, and how hard. The silence after Boebert's final declaration didn't dissipate. It calcified. It sat like a stone on every chest in the chamber, heavy and disorienting. Jasmine Crockett had waited. She had let the lie unravel itself in real time. And now, like a scalpel drawing its first line across infected flesh, she spoke. Low, deliberate, and devastating. "Tell me something, Congresswoman," Jasmine said, slowly leaning into her mic. Her voice was steady, but it carried an edge sharp enough to strip paint. Where did you earn your medical degree? The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The impact came not from volume, but from the precision, like glass cracking under pressure. All eyes snapped to Boebert, whose smirk faltered for a breathless second. Because in this room, we're dealing with lives, not likes. And I'd like to know how a woman with no clinical training feels entitled to override the data of tens of thousands of epidemiologists, virologists, and public health scientists. There were no gasps this time, just the stillness of impact, the kind that falls when someone finally says what others were afraid to. Without breaking eye contact, Jasmine reached down and retrieved a folder with the CDC emblem stamped in black ink. She held it like evidence in a murder trial, because that's what it was. This is a compiled mortality report, data collected from every major hospital system in the country between March 2020 and September 2022. She flipped it open with slow, practiced control. According to these findings, the average COVID-19 death rate in states that rejected vaccine mandates was 7 times higher than in states that followed CDC guidelines. Her finger tapped the line graph projected on the digital screen behind her, where red spikes towered over shaded gray baselines. The numbers weren't abstract. They were portraits of disaster. They told the story Boebert had tried to erase. Jasmine's voice lowered, but the weight in it grew. That's not politics. That's not opinion. That's human loss quantified. Families decimated, wards overrun, morgues extended into parking lots. Her hands remained still, but her words pulsed with suppressed fury. These aren't statistics, ma'am. These were people with birthdays and dreams. People who couldn't zoom into safety. People who trusted their leaders and died for it. She let the silence drag for a full 3 seconds. So no, she continued, her voice sharpening like ice. This isn't a place for conspiracy theory cosplay. This is a place where truth is supposed to matter. And the truth is, your words cost lives. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was measured, documented, named. And sitting at the heart of it was a woman who had weaponized distrust, who now sat in silence as her narrative unraveled under the weight of the dead. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. She had facts. She had names. And most of all, she had the unbearable authority of lived reality, standing in stark contrast to the shallow confidence of someone who had never once stepped inside an overcrowded ICU at midnight and watched a nurse sob behind fog goggles. Jasmine didn't just win the moment, she buried the lie with it. The screen behind the dais was still pulsing with graphs. Lines of red bleeding into columns of black, visual proof of human loss. But Lauren Boebert wasn't looking. She reached instead for a small remote control, lips curling into that trademark grin she wore like armor. A quiet beep echoed as the screen flickered, cutting from data-backed reality to a grainy video. Let's try something real, Boebert said, pressing play. Instantly, a dimly lit YouTube clip filled the display. A man with a backwards ball cap and oversized microphone stared into the lens with wild eyes and caffeinated urgency. They want you scared, people, he shouted, his voice trembling with performative conviction. Hospitals were paid to label everything as COVID. The jab, it's poison. Big Pharma runs DC now, wake up. The logo in the corner, Unchained Patriot Vibes, spun like a punchline. No credentials, no citations, just outrage, monetized in 1080p. Jasmine Crockett stared at the screen, lips slightly parted in disbelief. Not at the content, but at the audacity. For a second, she said nothing. The committee room shifted again, this time not in fear, but in sheer disbelief. One lawmaker sighed audibly. A staffer in the second row actually rolled her eyes. But Boebert looked pleased, as though she had finally brought the truth into the room, not realizing she had only dragged in another echo chamber. Jasmine slowly leaned forward, adjusted her mic, and allowed herself a brief, clipped laugh. Not from amusement, but from the absurdity of what she was witnessing. Then, with pinpoint calm, she delivered the sentence that would ricochet through social media within minutes. I asked where you got your medical degree, she said, the corner of her mouth twitching in restraint. Not which YouTube rabbit hole you tripped into before breakfast. The room cracked, one short burst of laughter from a gallery member, immediately silenced by the chairman's gavel. Boebert's smirk faltered. Jasmine didn't wait. Her tone shifted, steel replacing silk. This is what you brought to the table? A man with a ring light, a Venmo QR code, and a 12-minute rant about government lizard people? Her voice dropped, not in volume but in gravity. While black and brown families in my district were standing in line at overrun clinics, clutching folders of expired insurance, praying for test kits, this man was cashing ad revenue for calling it all a hoax. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The weight of what she said flattened every smirk in the room. This is the insult, she continued, eyes locked on Boebert now. Not just to science, not just to the dead, but to the very idea that truth still has value in this chamber. Her hands remained still on the desk, palms flat, as if holding the entire chamber in place. You can wave videos around like weapons, but they don't change the facts. They don't unbury the dead. That was the wound laid bare, the unbearable injustice of watching trauma dismissed by someone who had never carried it. Jasmine had come prepared for a hearing. What she'd walked into was a circus, and now she was setting fire to the tent. The room was still recovering from the sting of Jasmine's dismantling of Boebert's YouTube stunt when the screen behind her changed again. This time not with sarcasm, not with graphs, but with death. No sound, no animation, just a single black title card in stark white font. Wilcox County, Alabama. The room seemed to dim, not from lighting, but from gravity. The first image faded in. A young man, no older than 25, standing beside a broken-down pickup truck, his Walmart name tag still clipped to his chest. Then came another, an elderly woman smiling beneath the steeple of a modest red-brick church. Then another, a mother of 3 holding a birthday cake that read, Javon turned 7. One by one they came, 43 faces, 43 names, and the date of each death scrolling beneath. March 2021, April 2021, June, July, September, all within the span of 8 months, all unvaccinated, all gone. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She waited until the last image held on screen, a group photo at a church picnic, 6 of whom were later buried in the same week. Then her voice returned, measured, low, not performative but personal. Wilcox County has just under 10,000 residents, she said. It's one of the poorest counties in Alabama. You won't find a hospital with an ICU there. You won't find mobile vaccine clinics. What you will find is graves. Her eyes moved deliberately across the committee members, landing briefly on Boebert, who now sat noticeably stiffer. These people didn't die because they were reckless. They died because access to truth didn't reach them in time. And while some were out here calling public health a hoax, this community was running out of oxygen, literally. She placed both hands on the table. The screen behind her froze on the image of a smiling grandmother named Loretta Mayfield, age 63, who died on her front porch waiting for an ambulance. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but her voice didn't waver. We've heard a lot today about personal liberty, about the right to reject science, about the freedom to ignore doctors. But let's be clear. She paused not for effect, but because the next line required absolute clarity. Personal freedom does not mean the right to push someone else into a grave. The words rang out with the finality of a verdict. No one dared move. Even the usual background rustle, papers shifting, aides whispering, was gone. 2 Republicans stared down at the table. One female staffer wiped her eyes subtly. A camera zoomed in on Boebert's face, but she wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She was looking past it, jaw clenched, hands fidgeting under the table. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't blink. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about forcing the room to reckon with what had been so casually ignored. The injustice wasn't just in who died. It was in how easily their deaths had been erased by politics, memes, and slogans shouted into cameras. And now for one moment, those erased were seen, counted, grieved. The images of the dead were still glowing behind Jasmine. 43 lives reduced to silence, when the tension in the room snapped like a brittle wire. Lauren Boebert, eyes blazing and voice tight with fury, slammed her hand flat against the table, the sound echoing through the hearing room like a rifle crack. "You don't get to lecture me about freedom," she spat, rising slightly from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't own the Constitution. You don't get to decide whose liberty counts." Her voice wasn't just angry. It was desperate, unraveling. "I represent people too, and they don't want to be ruled by fear. They don't want to be told what to put in their bodies. That is tyranny, not policy." Every eye in the chamber locked onto her, some with disgust, some with alarm. But Jasmine didn't move. Her hands were still flat on the table, her breath steady, anchored by years of standing in rooms where truth came second to volume, where pain, especially black pain, was ignored, then politicized, then erased. She let the echo of Boebert's outburst hang there a beat longer, filling the room like smoke in a closed space. Then slowly she sat back in her chair, turned her head just slightly, and met Boebert's glare with something colder than anger. Clarity. "Your freedom," Jasmine said, her voice low but carved in stone, "ends where someone else's breath begins." The sentence didn't rise, it landed, like the quiet drop of a stone into deep water. No splash, just pressure, the kind that lingers, the kind that drowns. A gasp came from somewhere in the gallery, hushed immediately by the weight of what had just been said. Jasmine leaned in slightly, eyes never leaving Boebert's. "Because what you're calling freedom," she continued, voice tightening like a noose, "is the privilege to ignore the consequences you'll never have to face. You walk into rooms like this and preach about liberty while others bury their children. That isn't bravery. That's abandonment wrapped in slogans." The room didn't breathe. Not the aides, not the committee members, not even the journalists typing behind raised laptop screens. Because Jasmine hadn't just answered. She had reframed the battlefield. She wasn't arguing policy. She was exposing a moral rot. And Boebert, still standing, suddenly looked smaller, not silenced by force, but by the unbearable mirror held up in front of her. A mirror showing the cost of weaponizing freedom against those who could least afford to bear it. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung in the air like smoke in a sealed room. Dense, unbreathable. Boebert hadn't replied. She couldn't. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Because beneath every shouted claim of freedom, beneath every deflection and slogan, lay something uglier, something transactional, and Jasmine was about to tear the mask off. She reached down and retrieved a new folder, thicker, marked in red tabs, and stamped with the official crest of the Federal Election Commission. She didn't wave it. She didn't posture. She opened it like a prosecutor unsheathing the final piece of evidence in a trial that had already started tilting. "Madam Chair," Jasmine said, her tone shifting into something colder, calmer, and lethal. "I am submitting into the record FEC filing number 2022-30871-B, dated October 7th of last year." She held the document up, page angled slightly so that the C-SPAN camera could catch the bolded line. "Liberty Shield PAC, $48,000 donation to Boebert for Congress." Her eyes didn't leave Boebert's face. "This PAC is widely known for promoting vaccine disinformation under the guise of medical freedom. But what's worse," she paused, flipping to the next page, now yellow highlighted, "is that Liberty Shield's primary donor is a pharmaceutical shell corporation currently under federal investigation for producing unregulated, counterfeit therapeutic supplements, marketed as COVID cures." A shift rippled through the room. Chairs creaked, aides whispered. Someone in the press row dropped a pen. It wasn't outrage yet. It was recognition. The scent of scandal had just hit the bloodstream of the chamber. Jasmine stood firm. While communities like Wilcox County were begging for access to real medicine, she continued, her voice sharpening, this operation was pushing lies wrapped in capsules. And according to these filings, your campaign took their money. Her final word landed with such force that even the chair visibly stiffened. Suddenly, the speaker system shrieked, a jarring burst of feedback as one of Boebert's staffers fumbled beneath the desk, yanking at the mic cable. The static tore through the air like a scream no one wanted to hear. The chair tapped the gavel, but the moment had already ruptured. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was a visual metaphor, raw and transparent, a system breaking down under the pressure of exposure. Boebert stared straight ahead, her knuckles clenched on the edge of the table, face unreadable but pale. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her next words were delivered with the unblinking certainty of someone who had prepared for this moment, down to the breath. "So I ask you now, Congresswoman," she said, eyes narrowing, voice barely above a whisper, but broadcast live to millions. "Have you been using fear, not to protect the public, but to profit from it?" Her question fell like a blade. No sound followed, because what had just been asked wasn't a political jab. It was an accusation, documented, named, and now public. The room had already shifted. Boebert's silence under Jasmine's accusation had left a hollow tension behind, like the air had been sucked out of the chamber, but no one dared to breathe it back in. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver a speech. Instead, she turned slightly to the side and gave a quiet signal. The doors at the rear of the hearing room creaked open, and a woman stepped forward. No entourage, no theatrics, just the steady steps of someone who'd spent more nights in trauma wards than on camera. Her nameplate simply read, Amelia Ramirez, R.N., Pediatric ICU. She was still in her scrubs. The blue fabric had faded at the collar. Her eyes carried something deeper than exhaustion, something that had been broken and never quite put back together. She took her seat beside Jasmine with the grace of someone used to moving quietly so as not to wake the dying. No opening statement, no rehearsed soundbite, just a trembling breath, and then, her name was Layla. Her voice barely lifted above a whisper, but the room leaned in as one. She was 8, perfect attendance, loved math. She was funny. Her favorite color was green. A pause, then the descent began. She came in with shortness of breath. No one thought it was COVID at first. Her family had been told kids don't get that sick, that vaccines weren't needed, that the media had exaggerated everything. Amelia's voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. By the time she got to us, her lungs were failing. We tried. God, we tried. BiPAP, 4 steroids, proning. At one point, 5 of us were in the room, pushing everything we had into that little girl's chest. She looked up at me during a moment of lucidity. Her lips were cracked. Her oxygen mask fogged every few seconds. And she said, the nurse paused, squeezing her hands together until her knuckles went white. She said, I was good. So why didn't anyone save me? That sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. It just sat there, heavy, unforgivable. No one moved. Jasmine didn't even breathe. Not yet. Boebert's face had drained of color. She looked down, then to the side, then abruptly stood, her chair groaning against the tile floor as she turned to whisper to her aide. Without waiting for a recess or even a glance from the chair, she stepped away from the table and left the room. The door shut behind her with a soft click, but it might as well have been a gunshot. The press gallery blinked to life. Phones came up, keys clacked. A reporter muttered, she just walked out. Tweets went flying. Boebert exits during emotional testimony from frontline nurse. Layla's story draws silence and scandal. But inside the chamber, the noise hadn't returned. No one spoke. Because how do you respond when the consequence of policy isn't a statistic, but a child's last question? One that no one in that room, especially Lauren Boebert, was prepared to answer. The image of Layla and her final whispered question still hung in the room like smoke in a church after a fire. Everyone could still smell the loss. The silence was sacred, untouched. But when the door creaked open and Lauren Boebert returned to her seat, the atmosphere shifted again. This time not with grief, but with calculation. Her jaw was set tighter than before, her steps rehearsed as if she'd convinced herself during those few minutes outside that emotion could be countered with conspiracy. Without waiting for recognition, Boebert slid a single printed sheet onto the table in front of her, the crisp paper slicing against the polished wood like a provocation. She leaned into her mic, her tone now colder, less frantic, measured, as if she'd practiced every word. What the Congresswoman won't mention, she began, holding the paper aloft, is this. She gave it a dramatic shake. A leaked email from inside the CDC, sent by a senior data officer, confirming what many of us already suspected, that data was selectively revised to, quote, maintain public trust. In other words, manipulated, hidden. Her voice hardened with each syllable. If our citizens were forced to change their lives based on altered numbers, then the entire narrative we were fed needs to be re-examined. How many decisions were made on fear, not fact? How much truth was buried under expert guidance? Gasps rippled faintly through the gallery, not because of the document itself, but because of the brazenness with which it was presented. As if one page pulled from the internet could erase science, testimony, and human cost in a single motion. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't glance at the paper. She simply sat, her eyes locked on Boebert with an expression that was neither surprised nor amused. Just done. And when she finally spoke, it was with such terrifying stillness that the room had to lean forward to hear. If that email is real, she said slowly, then let's put this show to the test. A pause, then the dagger. Let's subpoena the person who signed it. Right here, right now, under oath. The words didn't just strike, they detonated. For a second there was no air. Then came the sound. Applause, loud and unrestrained, broke like a thunderstorm across the chamber. Cameras swiveled, phones were raised. Even a few aides on the Republican bench turned their heads, some stunned, some stricken. Boebert blinked but said nothing. Because Jasmine hadn't argued. She hadn't deflected. She'd done something far more dangerous. She'd said, prove it. And in that moment, the momentum didn't just shift. It shattered. The room had seen the line between theater and truth, and Jasmine Crockett had drawn it in permanent ink. The roar of applause from Jasmine's daring challenge had only just begun to fade when a quieter, sharper force cut through the air like a razor. Confirmation. From the rear of the press gallery, a hand rose, measured, confident. It belonged to Thomas Ellery, a Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist with The Guardian. He didn't shout, he didn't wave. He simply held up a single-page printout and handed it to a congressional staffer, who immediately moved with urgency, weaving through rows of chairs like a courier in a war zone. Jasmine clocked the gesture without blinking. She recognized the name on the byline. If Ellery had it in writing, it was already fact. The paper landed on her desk without ceremony. Jasmine scanned it in silence. Across the top margin, independent verification report, origin of alleged CDC email. She flipped to the second paragraph, and there it was, clear, damning, undeniable. The leaked email Boebert had held like a torch of truth was traced back to a known disinformation cell operating through a proxy domain registered in Moldova, linked to a far-right digital network flagged by both the FBI and the EU Cybersecurity Commission. The email had never originated from the CDC. It had never even touched American soil. It was forged, spread, and absorbed by those desperate for ammunition, regardless of the cost. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Her face remained unreadable, but her movements grew deliberate, precise, like a soldier assembling her weapon for the final strike. She stood slowly, the document in hand, and walked across the room with a calm that screamed louder than any outburst ever could. Every step was watched. The entire chamber shifted into slow motion as she reached Boebert's table. No security stopped her. No voice intervened. Because everyone, even those who had once doubted her, understood they were witnessing something elemental. Jasmine placed the paper down gently, deliberately, right in front of Boebert. She didn't throw it. She presented it as one might place a mirror before someone refusing to see their reflection. Then in a voice so quiet it forced the room to lean in, she spoke. You said you were fighting for truth, she began, each word polished with restraint and venom. So here it is, verified, sourced, and exposed. She tapped once, lightly, but the sound echoed like a gavel. This document confirms your evidence is a forgery, created by a foreign propaganda network known for targeting American voters during crises. Her eyes didn't waver. So if truth really matters to you, Congresswoman, sign your name. Right here. Acknowledge this document as false. Own what you introduced into this chamber. The silence was no longer fragile. It was weaponized. Boeber's fingers twitched near the edge of the paper, but never touched it. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. Her eyes didn't meet Jasmine's, because this wasn't a political checkmate. It was something far more intimate. Jasmine had dragged the lie out into daylight, placed it between them, and demanded accountability with no place left to run. The injustice wasn't only in the forged email, it was in how casually it had been used to deflect from the dead. And now, with the truth staring her in the face, Lauren Boebert's refusal to sign said more than any speech ever could. The moment hung in the air like the final note of a symphony. Jasmine Crockett's call for Boebert to sign the verification report had been met with silence. The kind that said everything without saying a word. No signature, no denial, no defense. Just trembling fingers, pressed lips, and cameras zoomed in close enough to capture the absence of courage. And then the flood began. As Jasmine stepped back to her seat, laying the document flat on her table like a final card in a brutal game, the media engines roared to life. Phones vibrated. Press badges flashed. Journalists who had spent weeks covering talking points were now scrambling to rewrite their headlines in real time. The chamber, once a war zone of words, now became a broadcast studio for something much bigger, a reckoning. Within minutes, every major outlet broke in with the same urgent phrasing, as if synchronized by an invisible thread of truth snapping across the political landscape. CNN interrupted their programming with a red banner. Capitol hearing ignites firestorm. False evidence linked to foreign disinformation cell. Fox News, usually slow to pivot, cut to commercial mid-interview and returned with an anchor's stunned face and the words, "Congressional clash turns critical." Boebert's source exposed as forgery. MSNBC's Chiron went further. Hearing on COVID policy becomes defining moment in America's war on misinformation. The phrase, defining moment, repeated across outlets, as if something more than a debate had occurred, as if history had pivoted. Outside the Capitol, the story spread like wildfire. It didn't matter where you stood politically. Everyone saw it, everyone heard it, and no one could pretend it hadn't happened. Talk radio hosts who'd once pushed skepticism paused their rants. On-air anchors stuttered through their scripts. The image of Jasmine standing across from Boebert, holding the document like a mirror too bright to avoid, became the lead photo on every homepage from Politico to The Atlantic. Conservative bloggers scrambled to validate the email and found only digital ash. Even tech platforms like Meta and X, formerly Twitter, moved quickly, flagging Boebert's earlier posts that had promoted the now exposed document. And then came the wave no one expected. Messages began pouring into the public comment threads beneath the livestream archive, not from loyal partisans, but from former skeptics. A retired paramedic in Arkansas wrote, "I used to think it was all media spin, but watching her today, that was real." A woman from Ohio posted, "I lost my brother last year. I believed the wrong people. I think I owe Jasmine Crockett an apology." And more kept coming. Quiet, confessional, raw. Not all changed their minds. Not all were moved. But the ones who were, they weren't shouting. They were finally listening. And that, in a war built on noise, was seismic. Inside media control rooms, producers scrambled to adjust their evening rundowns. News Nation moved up a panel segment by 3 hours. NPR recorded an emergency podcast. Even conservative-leaning Sinclair affiliates had no choice but to report what was plainly unfolding. A congressional beatdown not built on outrage, but on unflinching, documented truth. Experts from Columbia Journalism School tweeted analysis threads. Former federal agents confirmed the foreign source of the forgery. Intelligence circles hinted, quietly but firmly, that the digital signature had appeared in similar operations during previous election cycles. Coordinated, targeted, and now unraveling live. Back in the Capitol, Jasmine remained still. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried more authority than the loudest grandstanding. Boebert, meanwhile, avoided eye contact with the press as aides shielded her departure. No questions were answered. No follow-up was offered. The damage was done. And for once, the cost wasn't just political, it was personal. Because what had been exposed wasn't a bad argument. It was a system, a pipeline of fear monetized into influence. A campaign built on convenient distortion, collapsing in real time under the weight of one woman's refusal to be intimidated. Later that evening, as primetime shows scrambled for guests and former officials lined up to comment, the conversation shifted from party lines to something deeper: accountability. What did it mean to govern in an age where lies traveled faster than grief? What did it mean for a child's death to be countered by a YouTube link, and for that link to collapse under scrutiny? Jasmine Crockett hadn't just called out a falsehood. She had stood in the rubble of America's information war and said, "You will not bury the truth with noise." And somewhere, between the gasps and the headlines, between the stunned silence and the applause, the country, fractured as it was, leaned forward to listen. The injustice Jasmine had faced wasn't just Boebert's tactics. It was the reality that truth had become something you had to fight to prove, even when it was printed in ink and confirmed by federal agencies. That pain, even when real, could be dismissed as performance, until it became undeniable. She hadn't simply won an argument. She'd forced the nation to stare into the machine that had blurred fact and fiction until lives were lost and blame was profit. And for the first time in a long time, the machine blinked. Because this wasn't just a hearing, it was a turning point. One woman, one document, one lie too far. And in the silence that followed, something rare happened. The noise didn't return. The Capitol hearing room hadn't even cooled before the global response began to surge, like aftershocks of a political earthquake that had cracked far beyond the marble walls of Congress. What started as a tense domestic hearing on vaccine misinformation had, within 48 hours, transformed into an international headline. And at the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, not just a congresswoman, not just a witness, but a singular force who had drawn a red line through the chaos and dared the world to look closer. Her act of holding the line against manufactured lies had pierced the digital fog, and the world had noticed. In Geneva, Switzerland, the World Health Organization convened its weekly summit on global health strategy, a routine meeting often lost in bureaucratic reports and cautious phrasing. But this time, it opened with something different: a formal statement, broadcast live, read aloud by the Director General himself. In an era where public trust has eroded and misinformation endangers lives on every continent, he said, it is imperative we recognize those who defend evidence, not for applause but for accountability. We thank Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of the United States for her fearless confrontation of disinformation during this week's congressional hearing. Her voice, grounded in loss and guided by truth, reminds us what global public health requires most: courage. The chamber erupted, not with applause but with knowing nods from delegates who had seen too many lives lost to propaganda dressed up as liberty. The clip went viral. Subtitled versions appeared in over a dozen languages within hours. In Milan, a consortium of physicians from the Istituto Superiore di Sanità, the Italian National Institute of Health, downloaded the full hearing video and added it to their training module for new emergency medicine interns. They titled it La Verità in Aula, The Truth in the Chamber. Trainees were told to study not only the data Crockett used, but her composure, her cross-examination, and her refusal to be baited by theatrical misinformation. A lead instructor paused the footage during Jasmine's quiet rebuke. "Your freedom ends where someone else's breath begins," and told the class, this is how you advocate. Not with volume, with unshakable clarity. But not all attention was commendation. In Washington, a very different kind of reckoning was beginning to form. Inside the House Ethics Committee, senior staff received a packet from an independent fact-checking consortium that included sworn statements from cybersecurity experts, flagged social media posts, and the source report confirming the forged email introduced by Lauren Boebert. Normally, such items would languish in procedural purgatory, but not this time. Pressure came not just from Democrats, but from centrists, moderates, and even a few Republicans who understood that there were lines too dangerous to ignore. The accusation was direct: knowingly entering forged foreign disinformation into the congressional record. It wasn't just a political embarrassment, it was a national security issue, one that could set precedent, one that couldn't be allowed to vanish beneath the usual smokescreens. The request for Boebert to appear before the Ethics Committee was drafted and submitted within 24 hours. It carried the signatures of 4 committee members across the aisle, a quiet signal that the game had changed. That misinformation wasn't just a nuisance. It was now being treated as an ethical breach with real consequences. For Jasmine, none of this came with triumph. She didn't tour morning shows. She didn't post celebratory selfies. She returned to her office, sifted through the voicemails from grieving parents, and silently reviewed the letters she'd received from hospitals in Georgia, Tennessee, and Arizona, each recounting families who had replayed her hearing for their children as a teaching moment. One nurse wrote, "For the first time since this pandemic began, my patients' families are asking the right questions again." Another simply wrote, "Thank you. You made us feel less alone." But even amid praise, Jasmine understood something deeper, something darker. The injustice she'd faced wasn't just Boebert's attempt to deceive. It was the fact that it had been so easy to do, that millions would have believed the forged email if no one had challenged it, that for every Layla, every child lost in silence, there was someone ready to trade their death for political leverage. The emotional toll didn't come from the battle. It came from knowing how close the truth had come to being erased altogether. Meanwhile, Boebert's office offered no direct comment, only a brief statement claiming she had acted in good faith and was awaiting the results of further verification. But verification had already arrived, and America had seen her stare at the paper and refuse to sign. Networks replayed the clip in slow motion. Analysts dissected the moment like it was a national trauma. One former intelligence official on CNN said, "That document wasn't just a lie, it was a loaded weapon." And she walked into a government hearing and pulled the trigger on democracy. The language was no longer about policy, it was about intent, about danger, about lines crossed and lies unpunished. In private circles, some House leaders whispered about censure. Others debated whether to strip Boebert of her committee assignments. But the public pressure was mounting faster than the institution could react. Editorials from newspapers both left and right called for accountability. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline, "The Lie Too Far, When Theater Becomes Threat." The Washington Post featured an op-ed titled, "Crockett Didn't Just Challenge a Colleague, She Exposed a System." The air was charged, something had shifted, and in that shift, truth began to feel, not invincible, but possible again. Still, Jasmine knew the danger hadn't passed. Truth had won a moment, not the war, and that war had many fronts, online, in classrooms, on ballots. But something undeniable had occurred. In a hearing meant to be another spectacle of tribal posturing, a new standard had emerged, not of moral perfection, but of moral pressure. To speak plainly, to stand firm, to not let the dead be erased by the loud. And Jasmine had done it under a microscope, under fire, and without losing the quiet in her voice. As dust settled on Capitol Hill that day, the corridors were quieter than usual. Not out of fatigue, but reverence. Staffers walked slower. Journalists lingered near closed doors, still whispering about the ripple effects. Inside her office, Jasmine sat alone with the lights off, the glow of her computer screen illuminating a single paused frame. Layla, age 8, smiling in a school portrait. Jasmine stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just remembered. Because for her, this wasn't over. It never would be. And beyond the hill, across cities and continents, people were beginning to ask harder questions. Not just what happened, but what had we allowed to happen? And somewhere inside that reckoning, for just a moment, the noise fell away. And the truth stood alone, unwavering. The flood of global responses, the ethics committee referral, and the silent unraveling of a falsehood once held up as gospel had transformed the room. But the most important moment hadn't arrived yet, because in all the noise and consequences, one thing remained untouched: the moral reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett, who had stood firm through accusation, disinformation, and calculated deflection, now turned not to rebut, but to redefine. She rose from her seat slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of deliberate intent, like a final crescendo building in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. The lights above her dimmed slightly as the cameras adjusted, zooming in. This wasn't testimony anymore. This was the moment when grief met fire, when memory became weapon. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't crack. It struck. Freedom, Jasmine said, does not exist when the truth is sacrificed for fame. The sentence hit the room like a verdict, silent, searing, inescapable. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned across the panel, the press, the aides who had watched every lie of the day with neutral expressions. We talk about liberty, she continued, but what kind of liberty lets the loudest voice win over the truest one? What kind of liberty lets a child die because adults chose denial over science? The weight of her words didn't just fall, they landed, each one sharp as broken glass on polished marble. She stepped forward now, just slightly toward the gallery. Not to confront, but to confront with them. Her voice dipped lower, quieter, as if the truth no longer needed to be shouted to be heard. I buried my cousin last year, she said. 32 years old, a mother of two. She was afraid to take the vaccine because she heard someone on TV call it poison. She trusted that voice more than the nurses in her own neighborhood. She paused, her breath steady but heavy. And when I visited her hospital room, when the tubes were already in and the beeping had slowed, she looked at me and said, I didn't know who to believe. The silence in the hearing room was unbearable. Chairs didn't creak. Phones didn't buzz. The cameras barely moved, as if the operators themselves were frozen in their viewfinders. Jasmine stood in that stillness, in that ache, and let the pain speak through her posture. So I ask you, she said, turning now toward the seated spectators behind the cameras, if a child dies because an adult rejected science, whose fault is that? Her voice wasn't sharp now. It was hollow, echoing, not theatrical but prophetic, as if calling something forward no one wanted to face. A beat passed, and another. Then, without a word, a Republican lawmaker sitting 2 seats down from Boebert lifted a trembling hand to his face and wiped a tear away. The camera operator, sensing history, zoomed in, but respectfully, slowly, like approaching a battlefield still smoldering. The man didn't speak. He didn't excuse himself, but his shoulders sank, his eyes lowered, and in that motion, there was more admission than any headline could capture. Jasmine noticed. She didn't acknowledge it with words. She didn't break her flow. But the smallest flicker of recognition passed behind her eyes. Pain, yes, but also connection. The cost had been seen. Finally, she returned to her desk without another word. Not out of retreat, but out of conclusion. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already been spoken, and now it lived on in silence. In the spaces between headlines, in the hesitation behind the next lie, in the hearts of every viewer who had seen the look on a man's face as he realized that the thing they'd all called politics had a body count. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone but unwavering, had made sure the world could no longer look away. The image of Jasmine Crockett standing in silence after her final question had become the symbol of something larger than a hearing. It had become the still point around which the nation turned. The moment didn't end when she sat down. It echoed. It carved itself into headlines, into newsrooms, into the uneasy hearts of lawmakers who now had to face what they had allowed to fester for far too long. And from that pressure, raw, public, and undeniable, came something rare in modern politics: movement. Within 72 hours, language was drafted for a bill that would have been considered impossible just 1 week prior. The initial title was dry, Health Integrity Safeguard Act, but inside the halls of the House it earned a new name, whispered first in committee chambers, then echoed across networks, the Truth in Public Health Act. But it didn't stop there. The final title that reached the floor for debate was bolder, unapologetic, and as direct as the woman who had inspired it, the Public Health Truth Protection Act. Its purpose was simple, and its fire unmistakable. The bill sought to establish clear, enforceable consequences for public officials who knowingly disseminated false scientific information while holding elected office or testifying before government bodies. Not opinions, not disagreements, but deliberate, provable lies with real public health consequences. For Jasmine, the bill was not a victory lap. It was war continued by other means. She stood behind it not for political gain, but because she had seen firsthand how easily the truth could be drowned in manufactured doubt. During the closed-door drafting sessions, she brought case files, photos of ventilator shortages, testimonials from overwhelmed nurses, signed affidavits from families who had lost loved ones after misinformation, delayed treatment, or trust. At one point, a staffer offered to redact some of the more graphic details for decorum. Jasmine refused. Decorum didn't bury these people, she said coldly. Cowardice did. The day of the vote arrived under an overcast sky. Outside the Capitol, hundreds gathered in quiet demonstration, not protesting, but demanding. Nurses in scrubs, doctors in white coats, parents holding laminated photos of their children. There were no chants, no signs dripping in ideology, just faces, just presence. They weren't asking for ideology. They were asking for accountability, for science to mean something again, for truth to be more than a segment on TV. Inside the chamber, the debate was tense. Some lawmakers still clung to the thin veil of freedom of speech, twisting it to defend even the deliberate distortion of scientific consensus. But others, moved by the sheer volume of evidence, the pressure from their districts, and yes, the unignorable poise of Jasmine Crockett, stood up one by one to declare that the manipulation of science for power had to end. Jasmine herself gave no lengthy speech before the vote. She simply rose, looked out over the rows of seats, and said, "If we do not protect truth in health, then we are not protecting life. And if we do not protect life, then none of us deserves this seat." Then she sat down. Nothing else needed to be said. When the vote was called, the tension was unbearable. The gallery leaned in. Reporters stopped writing. The first numbers came quickly. AES from the expected corners. Then a few surprising ones. Then another and another. When the final tally was read, 258 in favor, 177 opposed, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. A low murmur of disbelief swept across the gallery. Staffers looked at each other in stunned silence. The bill had passed. Not narrowly, not symbolically, decisively. For Jasmine, it was a strange kind of justice, quiet and heavy. She walked out of the chamber alone, without cameras or speeches. The only thing in her hand was a folded piece of paper, a printed email from the CDC's data division, thanking her for restoring the credibility we feared we had lost forever. Outside, she didn't speak to the press. She stopped only to hug a woman in scrubs holding a candle with a photo of her brother taped to the base. They didn't exchange names. They didn't need to. In that embrace was everything the hearing had meant. The passage of the Public Health Truth Protection Act sent ripples across the world. International health organizations released statements of support. Law schools updated their ethics syllabi. Late-night hosts stopped joking and started quoting. For the first time in years, disinformation was no longer just a digital threat. It was a legislative liability. It had a name, and it had consequences. And in the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, not a firebrand, not a showboat, but something infinitely more dangerous to the culture of lies that had taken root. A woman who had looked directly at the machinery of distortion and refused to blink. She hadn't just confronted it. She'd outlasted it. She'd put it in writing, and now for the first time in a long time, the truth had legal teeth. The vote had passed, the chamber had emptied, and legislation now bore her fingerprint. But even as policy shifted and headlines reoriented themselves around what she had done, Jasmine Crockett carried the moment with the same solemn weight she'd walked in with. The war wasn't over. The dead weren't coming back. And while Congress moved on to the next battle, the people who mattered most, those who had lived in the shadows of misinformation and paid the price, had not forgotten. Neither had those who had fought beside them, who had worked night after night behind plastic shields, who had been called heroes by the very voices that later dismissed their warnings. And it was from that world, the one that lived not on C-SPAN, but in hospital wards at 3 a.m., that a different kind of recognition arrived. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the envelope came. No cameras, no press release, just a heavy cream-colored cardstock with the seal of the American Medical Association embossed at the top in gold. Inside was a single line: "You have been selected to receive the AMA Presidential Citation for exceptional advocacy in public health ethics." At first, Jasmine thought it was a mistake. She had never sought praise from the medical establishment. She had simply told the truth. But the letter was real, and so was the invite, to a closed-door, high-security ceremony during the AMA's annual National Symposium in Chicago. Attendance was limited to 100: doctors, scientists, policy architects, and this year one congresswoman. When Jasmine stepped onto the stage that night, the ballroom held its breath, not because of her name, but because of what it now represented. She wore a simple black suit, no entourage, no makeup team. Her only accessory was a small pin shaped like a stethoscope, given to her by a nurse in St. Louis after the hearing went viral. The podium lights caught the edge of her face as she looked out over the room, not of politicians, but of people who had written protocols, comforted the dying, fought hospital administrators for more gloves, more beds, more time, people who knew what it meant to lose while being told to calm the public. The AMA president took the stage first, clearing his throat before delivering words that would soon circle the globe. "We live in a time," he said, "where being loud is mistaken for being brave, where platforms matter more than principles. But what Congresswoman Crockett did was neither loud nor showy. It was correct, it was precise, and it was necessary." The audience remained still, not from indifference, but reverence. She defended the truth at a time when truth was a liability. She protected our work, our patients, and our purpose, without a medical license, but with more moral clarity than many who carry one. Then he stepped aside. Jasmine approached the microphone, pausing before she spoke, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of the podium. "I don't have a white coat," she said, her voice quiet, unwavering. "I don't know how to intubate a child. I can't read a lab panel or diagnose an arrhythmia. But I know how to listen to the people who can, and I know what happens when power silences them." She scanned the room, faces weathered by years of unrelenting trauma. "You weren't just fighting a virus. You were fighting a narrative, a system that treated your expertise as optional. And I wasn't brave, I was angry." She took a breath. "Because I come from a place where we don't get second chances when systems fail. We get body bags." Her voice didn't rise, but the room leaned in. "What I did in that chamber, I did for Layla, for the nurse who sat beside me, for every email I've received since from someone who said, 'I finally got vaccinated because of what you said.'" She didn't ask for applause. She didn't need it. The room, still locked in silence, didn't erupt. It stood. One by one, physicians and researchers, men and women who had watched governments ignore their warnings, who had been told their fear was political, rose to their feet in quiet solidarity. No fanfare, no music, just the sound of recognition from those who understood the cost of holding the line. Some wiped tears, others simply nodded. As the ceremony ended, a group of emergency room doctors approached her with something unexpected. It was a framed photo, not of Jasmine, but of a handwritten sign taped to a break room wall in a Brooklyn hospital. The sign read, "Truth saves lives. So does listening." Beneath it, someone had scrawled in red ink, "Crockett, H.R. hearing, March 4th. They didn't ask for autographs. They just wanted her to see that what she said in a chamber 700 miles away had reached them through the noise, had mattered. Jasmine left the stage alone, just as she had entered it, but now the silence followed her like an honor guard, not empty, not forgotten, but full of meaning, full of earned stillness. Because for once, the person who stood for the truth hadn't been drowned out. She'd been heard, and not just by politicians, but by those who'd been forced to scream into the void for years, hoping someone with power would listen. Jasmine had. And now the people who had saved millions without ever stepping into a courtroom were standing to thank her. The standing ovation at the AMA ceremony still lingered in the atmosphere long after Jasmine Crockett stepped off that stage. Not in noise, but in the way people paused before speaking her name now, with a reverence that hadn't existed weeks earlier. Her words, her stillness, her refusal to weaponize truth for clout had rippled beyond headlines and hearings. They had settled into the bloodstream of a country long sick with disinformation. But before the momentum could be co-opted or diluted by political machines, Jasmine agreed to one final interview. Just one. Not for legacy, not for spin, but because she knew that in moments of clarity, silence isn't enough. You have to write something down before history forgets. The interview took place in a small PBS studio in Washington, D.C. No live audience, no stage, no multi-camera drama. Just a quiet room, a wood-paneled backdrop, and one journalist with a legal pad full of notes and eyes that had seen too much to chase sensationalism. Jasmine arrived alone, carrying no script. Her only request: no pre-interview, no cuts, no softballs. "Ask me what needs to be asked," she said, adjusting her mic with practiced ease. The producer gave the countdown. 3, 2, 1. And then she began. "I never set out to be the face of anything," she said softly. "I didn't want to go viral. I didn't want hashtags. What I wanted was oxygen tanks where they were needed, truth where it had been stolen.